we're doing today is we're almost done. This is the hardest area of Deuteronomy. And then we're going to get into the blessings and the cursings, and then the book is essentially over. So I guess one thing I can do is this. This doesn't need to be on the recording. No, I'll ask later. I'll ask at the end. I want to know what people want to do once we're done with Deuteronomy, but I'll wait till Kim gets here, until Janine gets here, and then I'll ask that question. So we'll continue on. But if you can make it with me over the next 2 weeks or so, the hardest part of Deuteronomy is over. So I wanted to revisit a question that some people had from the end of Deuteronomy 22, and then we're going to look at Deuteronomy 23. And Deuteronomy 23 is really hard, and there's a reason why no one ever talks about this chapter. It starts off with a real bang, saying, "No man whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off can belong to the Lord's assembly." So you can imagine why this isn't the topic of a lot of sermons on Sunday mornings. And then there's all sorts of, starting in verse 9, there's all sorts of rules about cleanness. And I'm actually not going to read them because I don't want to, but you can read them yourself. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about cleanness and uncleanness. That's basically what I want to talk about. I think that'll be more profitable than just delving into minute details about these particular laws. We'll just talk about why they exist instead. So there it is. I know everyone's been waiting for Deuteronomy 23:1. And if that is the case, today is the day you have your wish. Because today we get to talk all about it. And about Jesus too, which might not seem like it fits, but it does. Okay, we stopped with verse 28 in chapter 22. And there was a question about it, and it was a really hard question. Deuteronomy 22 is about sexual ethics, about how God's people are supposed to put guardrails, or how God's people are supposed to deal with real world sinful events that are going to happen in a fallen world. And he gave some examples in chapter 22, starting in verse 22 and onward. He gave an example about what do you do when you have two parties, members of God's family, in consensual adultery? What do you do if you have a case of what looks like sexual assault, the man assaulting the woman? And then we have verse 28, and I confess I forgot to look at verses 28 to 29 last week. I just completely forgot, and so I really wasn't prepared to talk about it. This is what my translation reads, and yours probably has something similar. It's probably not quite as blunt. It probably tries to camouflage it with some euphemisms, but it says this: Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 to 29. Janine, hello.
Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late.
Yes. So this is what it says: if a man meets up with a young woman who is a virgin and is not engaged, he grabs her and has sex with her, and they're caught in the act. The man who had sex with her must give 50 silver shekels to the young woman's father. She will also become his wife because he's humiliated her. He's never allowed to divorce her. And the question came up last week. It sounds like God is commanding that she be sort of yoked to her rapist forever. And that sounds very weird and sort of counterintuitive, because God showed such sensitivity about real world situations in the last one, the last several examples. And here, it doesn't sound like it makes too much sense. So I've looked at several different translations. I've looked at several different scholars who've written on this. And basically my answer is, what do we do with verses 28 to 29? I really don't know. I don't know what to do with it. I know that's probably not, maybe it's not wise to confess that. I have no idea what to do with it. So verses 22 through the end of chapter 22, we have different scenarios. How are God's people supposed to make justice happen in these different situations? Consensual adultery, sexual assault. How should they apply wisdom to know whether it really was sexual assault or if it was actually consensual? So there's all sorts of real world implications here. But then verses 28 to 29, I'm really not sure. It says, if a man meets up with a young woman who is a virgin and not engaged, grabs her and has sex with her, and they're caught in the act, it almost sounds like we're talking about adultery here, but it says he grabs her. Your translation might have seizes her.
I'm sorry, verse.
Deuteronomy 22 verses 28 and 29.
Okay.
So the word, when it says he seizes her or he grabs her, the word is not as strong as the one in, it's not as strong as the one in verse 25, where it is sexual assault, but it still implies some sort of force or some sort of violence of action. So I can't quite get there that that verses 28 and 29 is a consensual thing. I can't. It says he's humiliated her. He's grabbed her, he's had relations with her, he's humiliated her, and yet she's commanded to she's obligated to marry him. It doesn't mean she can't divorce him if he's cruel to her or disobeys any of the requirements from the rest of God's law, but it says she has to marry him. And I'm just not sure what to do with it. It seems like it's not quite as bad as the guy just seizing her. Hey, Lucas, you can take her now. Now that she's unhappy, she can have her. So I know I could talk more about it, but I'll end up just talking in circles. I really am not quite sure what to do with this. The best I can come up with which may or may not be true, is that because the scenario in verses 28 and 29 it's not quite someone dragging someone off the street into a dark corner or some other sorts of awful evilness, but there is some sort of power on the man's part that he takes advantage of to get her. I'm not sure what it is, and I'm not sure why she's obligated to marry him.
Well, the punishment
That's
is
it.
different.
It is.
Between 28 and like 25.
Yeah, the punishment's different.
She was in 25. The woman was engaged, and this one she's not.
Yeah, so in verses 25, the rapist is killed. He deserves to die because of what he's done. But here, he's not.
Sounds consensual.
He doesn't get the death. That's what I'm saying. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's not as bad, but there's something going on there.
But they haven't gone through the proper steps here. I'm going to engage you and haven't.
But he grabbed her, or he grabs hold of her, or your translation might have in Deuteronomy 22:28, he seizes her. So
Yeah.
he
Mine
can't.
just says, but not engaged. This is NLT.
Yeah, yours is the one that doesn't say that. Yours is the one that doesn't give the idea of force. So we know a rapist is killed. A rapist dies. That's in verse 25. So that's clear. Another place in Exodus 22:16, where we have a guy who just seduces a single woman. He has to marry her, but it doesn't say anything about force in Exodus 22:16. So whatever's happening in Deuteronomy 22:28, there's some sort of in-between thing where it's not just he just seduced her and talked a really good game and got her to do something she shouldn't have. Something between that and a rapist, and I'm not sure what that is.
Well, he ends up having to pay the father 50 shekels of silver. Is that a lot of
Not
money?
to mention her husband, it's probably gonna, though the first one she's married and it's probably gonna come along.
Well, not this guy. She's not engaged.
No, the 28 one?
No, she's not.
No, she's not.
Yeah, so I don't off the top of my head, I don't know if how much 50 shekels is.
Sounds like a lot.
I just don't. It's probably a lot, but I just
What
don't
says
know.
2.5 pounds? What's
That
our
doesn't help
current?
either.
What's our current?
You have a British Bible, study Bible or something?
No,
It says it's just a note at the bottom, 2.5 pounds.
It's about 60 and $17 an ounce.
So 16 ounces.
Mine says,
It's not very much money.
I've got the Jewish one
Yeah.
up, and it says if they're caught in the act. So how do you get past the seizes her and if they're discovered?
Yeah.
So it sort of sounds aggressive, consensual.
Yeah, like I literally read a commentator who was just who basically was saying what you said, and he said something like, well, maybe it was just this ultra passionate affair, and I'm like, that sounds like one of your fantasies instead of reality, but I don't know. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, come on, really? I mean, this isn't a late night HBO movie. Come on, what are we actually talking about here? So I'm not. I think what you're saying, but still, it seems like an in-between thing. It seems like it's not just a seduction, and it's not rape. So there's something else. I'm not sure what it is. So there, I confess to you that I am lost. I'm adrift. I know nothing.
You know, we could always pray and ask God, and he'll reveal it to us.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But what I do think when we think about these sexual ethics, the takeaway for us is not to spend hours pondering what this meant when this situation, the context in which they were given doesn't exist anymore. What is clear is God takes sexuality really seriously, and God has a real keen interest in regulating sexual ethics among his people. People who aren't Christians might tend to think that Christians are just obsessed with sex and have an obsession with what people do in the bedroom or wherever. But God takes it extremely seriously what we do with our bodies, and the guidelines he's given his people in the old covenant on how they're supposed to take care of bad things that will happen because we're not perfect people show that he does take it seriously. And there's a gradation of punishment. Rapists are killed. Adulterers are killed. Someone who, where there's just sexual immorality with no adultery, are fined and receive some sort of punish, some sort of consequences for their actions. So God takes sexual ethics really seriously. If you want to know what God really thinks about sexual ethics, you need to read Leviticus 18, and then what Leviticus 18 says underlies everything Jesus says about sex and what Paul says about sex in 1 Corinthians 6 and in a bunch of other places. It's the foundation for everything they say. And verse 30 sort of appears out of nowhere. It sort of sounds like it's in Leviticus, but it's just here is like almost a throwaway. There's no explanation. There's no nothing. It's just there. And it says a man cannot marry his father's former wife so that his father's private matters are not exposed. Don't marry your mother, don't marry your ex-stepmother. And that's always good advice. Good advice. Eternal, timeless truth.
I have that one written on my bathroom.
Yeah, that's good. That's always good to remind yourself of that. This has nothing to do with anything we're just saying, but do you know that the president of France is married to his high school math teacher? Emmanuel Macron. He's married, he's in his 40s. He's married to a woman who's now in her 60s, and she was his high school teacher. But he's French, so you would expect that.
That's French behavior.
Yeah, and she left her husband for him too, so he must have been a diligent student.
He must have had mad math skills.
So anyway, but like I said, they're French. What can you say?
It happened in my high school.
It did?
I was there, yeah.
I was about to say, are you saying it happened to you?
No. The social teacher slept with one of the students, and she got pregnant, and he had to divorce his wife and marry her.
Well, I don't think it was quite that bad with the president of France, but yeah.
Still kind of.
All right, Deuteronomy 23. All right, why does God say, okay, so we're talking about a eunuch in Deuteronomy 23:1. We're talking about a eunuch. And the question is immediately going to come up, where does this come from? I mean, who on earth decides to just say, hey, you're about to go into the promised land. And by the way, it's important to know that a guy who has no testicles can't join your congregation. I mean, where does that even come from? That's not something most people would think about saying. So it's clearly it's clearly important enough that he mentions it and then doesn't explain, right? Because everyone knows the context of what he's saying. There are things that go on in our culture and news today that 50 years from now, 100 years, 200 years from now, no one will understand without explanation, but we all understand because we live in this era, in this time. So this is something that's clearly a problem then. And the question is, what on earth is going on here? Why is this person cut off? Why can't this person belong to the Lord's assembly? And the best explanation is that as part of some of these bizarre fertility god worship acts, some people would emasculate themselves. And I know that doesn't sound like much fun, and I'm not intending to try it, but it was a thing and it happened. And it was a thing. And what he's saying here is that if that's you and you've now joined God's family, you're still part of God's family, you're still part of the covenant, but there are lingering consequences for the life you used to lead that limit what you can do now in some way. Does God hate eunuchs? Is there a passage in the Old Testament where we can see more of God's heart for people who've come out of this awful lifestyle, where they cut their body parts off in order to worship God?
I don't know. Philip talked to the.
Okay, yes.
And he came to Christ.
Okay, so this is important. This is really important. Philip, the Ethiopian eunuch,
Oh, yeah.
Philip witnessed to this guy in Acts chapter 8, and I believe he's the first non-Jewish convert. He's from Africa. This is an African man who was converted to Christ and then goes back down to his kingdom and presumably spreads the gospel. And he's a eunuch. Okay, Lucas mentioned Isaiah. In Isaiah 56, we read this a few months ago, Isaiah 56, but in Isaiah 56, God is explaining his heart for people who think that they are less than part of God's family. Like they believe in God, but they feel like they're excluded. They feel like they're second-class citizens in some way. And he talks about people who are not ethnic Israelites who join the family, like people like Ruth, people like Rahab, people like that who aren't Jewish, but who've come to believe in the one God, and they've joined the family. There's this lingering stigma that if you're not Jewish, sure, you can be part of God's family, but maybe you're not really. Maybe you're like tier number 2, right? Second class, maybe third class. And the other group of people who God addresses are eunuchs, people who probably came out of pagan worship where, because of their devotion to worshiping Canaanite fertility gods, they cut off their body parts, which is a pretty bad mistake. But still, they did. But now they've joined God's family, so what are they supposed to do? What's God's heart for these people? And in Isaiah 56, verses 1 through 8, God makes it real clear. He loves those people. He loves anyone who comes to him. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what, even if you've cut off your body parts in worship and homage to a God that doesn't exist. If you come to Yahweh, he will accept you and love you. And Isaiah 56 makes that clear. I'll read like one verse, and then we'll go back to Deuteronomy. In Isaiah 56:4, the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what I desire and remain loyal to my covenant. These are eunuchs who love God. In my temple and courts, I will give them a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. You can't have kids because of mistakes you made before you knew who I was. But I'm going to give you something better than the sons and daughters you can't have. I will give to them an enduring name that won't be removed. And he says, he mentions the immigrants or foreigners, and then skipping down to verse 7, he says, I will bring them to my holy mountain and bring them joy in my house of prayer. I will accept their entirely burned offerings and sacrifices on my altar. My house will be known as a house of prayer for all peoples, says the Lord God, who gathers Israel's outcasts. And this is the important part. I will gather still others to those I've already gathered. I gather all the outcasts who are ethnic Jewish people, but I got a whole bunch of other people who I plan to gather too, including the foreigners and eunuchs and people who've worshiped false gods who've now come to see the truth. So now we come to Deuteronomy 23 in verse 1. When he says you can't belong to the Lord's assembly, he's not saying you're not part of the family. He's saying that on the 3 festival days, you can't join the community in the temple in Jerusalem. That's it. That's the only thing you can't do if you're one of these people. He still loves you. He still cares about you. And what Isaiah said is still true. But you just can't join in the celebrations inside the temple on the festival days during the year. And that's it. That's what he says. Questions or thoughts or raised eyebrows, 2, 3 raised eyebrows or anything you wanted to chat about with this? Does it seem wrong, mean, unforgiving? What do you think?
Well, the temple is supposed to be holy and God's holy. It's just like any priest or anybody from the family of the priest that have a problem. God doesn't want them to serve before him. And he wants perfect sacrifices. So it just has to do with the holiness.
Okay.
And the temple's holy.
Okay. When Philip spoke to the Ethiopian eunuch, was there ever any hint in the new covenant, the new and better covenant that's built on better promises, that the eunuch is under any restrictions like this, that he can't worship God like everyone else in some way? Was there any hint about that in Acts chapter 8? When you read Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, do you get the idea that the Ethiopian eunuch is in somehow some sort of second-class status as a Christian in any way? It's not a trick question. No, okay, no. And we'll talk about that in a minute. What Tim said is right. If you read this doesn't mean God hates people who made mistakes because they used to be someone else and who they're not anymore. Doesn't mean he hates people who make mistakes and who come out of a lifestyle that's opposed to God. It just means that here in the old covenant, God still welcomes them and loves them as part of his family and promises them an inheritance that's better than sons or daughters. But there's still consequences for things that you did when you used to be a different person. Those consequences of not being able to join with everyone on the festival days, those are gone. That consequence is trashed now because Jesus has come to make us all clean. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in this time, that's the only thing they couldn't do. I don't know if that means they hung out outside the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles, or if they weren't allowed to go to Jerusalem. I don't know what that means because none of us were there. And there's no YouTube footage to watch. It just means that they couldn't go participate in the feast. What that means, I don't know. But everything else, they're fine. They're equal. They're good. They're loved. Thoughts? I told you this was the hard part. We're going to power through. Have faith. Okay, fine. Drink more coffee. Verse 2. What does this sound mean to you? No one born of an illegitimate marriage can belong to the Lord's assembly either. Does that sound mean? What's up with this?
And their descendants for 10 generations.
Yes, and their descendants. It's not saying you're cut off from God's family. It just says, again, you can't go to the festivals, the 3 festivals every year. You can't participate in those inside at the temple with everyone else.
It's not exactly your fault that you were born out of an illegitimate relationship.
It's not your fault.
Like the sins of your fathers shall be passed down.
What's interesting is Jesus is descended from Perez, who is the offspring of Judah and Tamar's illegal liaison in Genesis 38. That's what's really interesting. Does everyone know that story? In Genesis 38, Judah is one, I get Jacob and Joseph confused. Judah is one of Jacob's 12 sons. And in Genesis 38, Judah is going along the road, and on impulse, he stops and hires well, Judah has sons. His sons get married and they die. And he's supposed to, when his youngest son is not quite old enough to marry, but according to the laws at that time, when he is old enough, Judah is supposed to give his youngest son to the widow of one of the sons that died. And I won't go into why. It's not a cruel thing, but he doesn't do it. And so she has no husband and she's pining away. And she decides to be crafty and to take matters into her own hands. She disguises herself as a cultic prostitute. And as Judah is just going along about his business, he sees her by the road. He knows she's a cultic prostitute. He doesn't know it's his daughter-in-law. And he hires her and has relations with her. And she becomes pregnant, which is what she did on purpose. And has a son. The son's name is Perez. And Perez is many generations back is one of Jesus's earthly forerunners. Jesus is descended from Perez. Jesus is a descendant, humanly speaking, from an illegitimate union, which is really not hilarious. It's really funny. It's really interesting that that's the case. Why would God have this here? What's the effect going to be if you're one of the Israelites and you're hearing all this and you're going to cross the Jordan to conquer the promised land and live for God and live holy lives and make God known, be a light for God while you wait for the Messiah to come. That's what they're supposed to do. If you hear these instructions, what is this going to do for you? What are you going to be thinking as you're waiting to cross over and you hear instructions like this? No one born of an illegitimate marriage can belong to the Lord's assembly. You're probably going to say, I shouldn't have illegitimate unions, right? I need to make sure I'm pure. I need to make sure that I stay on the path that I'm supposed to represent my God well.
So yeah, these laws and these the old covenant. I mean, things were they didn't operate and function as like say we do today, and they're God's laws. It could have been anything else, but everything was set up the way that he wanted it. So, sometimes it's beyond our level of understanding to try to comprehend the greatness and fullness of God's plan.
Yeah, he's giving them guidelines for practical life. He tells them to be holy, which sounds great. We all want to be holy, but now he tells us what it means to be holy, right? So we can we like to think about things in the abstract because it's easy to succeed when we don't have any real details about anything. Be a good person. Well, that's easy, as long as we don't know what it means. But once you start explaining what that means, and you're like, oh, well, that really sucks. Be holy. Sure, that's nice. That means don't do this or this. Oh, well, that really sucks. So he's giving details about what it means to be a holy people in a really messed up world.
So how does that apply to rape? I mean, that's not a legitimate, back in 28, 27, and 27, that's not a legitimate relationship. None of that took place. I mean, in the process of, I don't.
Yeah.
I need to speak to a theologian.
So then that the woman, let's say the girl gets pregnant, obviously. Well, so her descendant or her child from that is punished, right? Am I getting that?
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes sense. I don't think he's talking about a rape situation. I think he's just talking about a consensual situation where they get pregnant. That's what I think, because I think that would be opposed to God's character to do that to someone, especially when it certainly wasn't the woman's fault. So my guess is we're talking about a consensual situation where things got out of hand and they're pregnant.
You see, this is where non-believers really love to get a hold of stuff like this and be like, that's it, because they don't know how to properly interpret it, Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked.
So he's we need to, instead of trying to think about these as these weird abstract things, we should think about why is God giving this to them? And what does this say about God's heart? He wants his people to be holy and to lead clean lives. That's what he wants. And he knows we're going to mess up, which is why the sacrificial system has built-in mechanisms to take care of sin. Like, he doesn't expect us to be perfect. He knows we're not, or else the sacrificial system wouldn't need to be there. If you fall into sin, you're not planning to do it, but it happens because of an impulse or whatever, there's a way to fix it. If you plan to do something and then you do something wrong, you did it on purpose, there's a way to fix that too. There are ways to fix things you do wrong, but God is giving them rules, practical everyday rules for their life and their context on how they're supposed to love him and live holy lives. And his heart in verse 2 is it's almost a deterrent effect. If you're reading this, don't engage in illegitimate unions. Your children might suffer. And you don't want your children to suffer, do you? Of course not. So do the right thing, be holy about this, and wait and get married quickly, maybe. Just, be reasonable about this. All right, what's verse 3 mean? Does verse 3 seem contradictory?
An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever.
There's a bunch of instructions like this.
Ruth was Moabite.
Ruth was a Moabite.
Well, it says she's from the land of Moab. So
She's from Moab. Yeah. So what are we supposed to do with this? Is God contradict? Well, I guess
by Ruth's time, it may have been 10 generations.
In a generation.
But these people did not help Israel on their journey. Instead, they tried to figure out a way to do away with Israel.
So the wineskins, the old wineskins, were those the Moabites or were those the Amorites?
That was a Gideon.
Oh,
no, I don't know if it was something. Whoever they were, they started with the G. I know that's really highly technical, but I know what you're talking about. It started with a G, so how about that? I think, because there's all sorts of, in Ezra, there's the same thing is said. They come back to the land after the exile, and Ezra, and I forget if it's in Ezra or Nehemiah, but in Ezra/Nehemiah, there's Ezra criticizes people because they've married people from Moab, from Ammon. They've married foreigners, and he tells them to divorce them and to get rid of them. And there's the same sort of thing, like you can never, someone who's a Moabite or whoever can never enter God's family, which seems opposed to what we just read from Isaiah 56 about God loving foreigners who come to know him. So if you think about stuff.
Well, not only that, I mean, Moses married a black woman.
She did.
Not, and
He
Aaron
did.
and Miriam criticized were
Yes.
critical, and they had to pay a penalty. So this is really, why was that okay and this not?
Yeah. So if we believe that God doesn't contradict himself and we need to make these different things harmonize together, I think it makes sense to just say that in Deuteronomy 22:3, he's talking about unbelievers.
Yeah.
If you are a Moabite or an Ammonite, you don't know God, you don't love God, you have no place in this. You're never going to be able to join this assembly. I don't think that he's giving a blanket thing that says you can't possibly join the community, because I don't know about Rahab. Rahab's from Jericho, but still, 10 generations I don't believe had gone by from Sinai until the conquest. And you had tons of people who joined the community. Rahab's one of them. Ruth is an example, but that's a long time later, like Tim said. You have examples of people. You have Egyptians who come out of Egypt who join the family. So God loves people no matter where they're from, and he'll accept them if they join his family. So I think that verse 3 here is probably talking about unbelievers. I think, but I could be wrong.
No, I think it's
to
both.
what Moab and Ammonite did to the nation of Israel. So I wouldn't I wouldn't generalize it. Because later on, he says, they didn't give you food and water, and they hired Bilam to put a curse on you. But God did not listen to him. In fact, turned the curse around into a blessing because God loves you. You are never to seek their peace or well-being as long as you live. Plus, Moab and Ammonite, they came out of the union of Lot with his daughters, so it's also a curse on that relationship.
Cursed.
It's always been
Yeah.
in God's eyes, kind of this.
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I mean, that I can understand why that would make sense. All I'm saying is that if you want to harmonize God's love for foreigners that you see all over the Bible, I don't know if you can take Deuteronomy 22:3 in an absolute sense, because that seems contradictory. If you have a Moabite who hears about Yahweh, who wants to join the family, they're not allowed to. That sounds odd to me. But it doesn't mean that I'm right. This isn't a lecture, it's a discussion. You feel free to
Well, wouldn't it be somewhat like we do now? So we put sanctions on the country because they're doing whatever. But if an individual from that country said, I want to come to America because I don't like what my country is doing, they would be allowed into our country once they're vetted and all that stuff. But wouldn't that be more of it's a blanket over the nation? But if, Ruth follows Yahweh, then she is allowed in.
maybe.
Well, I think that they would
Yeah.
be treated like an illegitimate son in
Yeah.
the assembly.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying. So maybe, I don't know. Let's see. Let me skip ahead to, okay, we only have 15 minutes left. All right, you can read verses 9 to 14. I'm not going to read them, but I want to talk about why they exist. Does anyone have anything else they want to talk about with what we've mentioned so far? I was hoping we'd finish chapter 23, but that's not happening. It failed.
Marshalling has too many questions.
No one has anything else? Okay. There's always time. So what I think we'll do is, Ralph, is that Ralph?
Yeah, you let it in.
I did? Oh, hi, Ralph. I saw this sinister looking guy and I'm like, who is that? It's Ralph. Okay, so Deuteronomy 23 verses 9 to 14. Why do these rules exist? Leviticus 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, they all talk about the same sort of stuff. They talk about skin diseases, how to decontaminate your house and yourself if you have a skin disease. They talk about women after they've given birth, when you're clean and when you're unclean and how you can become clean. That's why Mary went to give a sacrifice for purification after Jesus was born. And she was poor, which is why they brought turtle doves as a sacrifice. So why do laws like this exist? Why does God care? What's the point? What does Jesus have to do with them? What does it mean when God says that you've become unclean? So that's what I want to talk about for the next 14 minutes.
Doesn't it mean that you've sinned in some way, that you've been clean?
Okay, so yes, there's two ways in which you can be unclean. One is, morally wrong, you sin, you do something bad. But there's another way you can be unclean too. Skin diseases, after giving childbirth, for women on a menstrual cycle, for men with a nocturnal emission, as this passage says, which is why I didn't read it. And so all these weird things, right? I'm never going to preach Deuteronomy 23 for a sermon on Sunday morning, in case anyone's wondering. But why is this weird stuff here, right? It's weird. Why am I reading this? Why are we talking about this now? Why does God care enough to mention this? That's the question. In what we're unclean morally, but we're also unclean ritualistically in some way for some things that aren't even our fault. It's nothing to do with us. Why?
It's just showing him all the things that bother him.
But he made us this way.
You're allowed to remain physically clean in this
Okay,
passage, but I mean, he also says at the end of it, you know, if you go out, go to the bathroom, make sure you cover it up or whatever, because God moves about in your camp to rescue you and to hand you over to your enemies. Therefore, your camp must be holy, a holy place. Adonai should not see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. It's a reminder that you have to be morally and spiritually clean, but also that translates to the external as well. If you're physically clean, then you have boundaries in your life that will keep you within the guardrails and help you maybe be.
why? Yeah, that's a good, that's an answer that a lot of people have reached for, because it does make sense. On some level, it does make sense. I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I think there's more than that, but it's there, right? These are hygiene things that are important. How to take care of a skin disease, stay away from people so you don't spread it to people. Okay, that makes sense. You know, so there's all sorts of medical or hygiene reasons for some of this stuff. But why do you have to bring why did Mary have to bring a sacrifice? What's she atoning for? What's wrong with giving birth to a kid? How is she unclean? She didn't do anything wrong by giving birth. God's the one who made her pregnant. I mean, why? What's with the ritual uncleanness? Because if you've never read Leviticus 12, 13, 14, you should read it, and then you'll see.
Does it have to do with some of it being consequences of like the original sin in the garden? Like pain of childbirth and the uncleanliness, and some of the topics you brought up would be things that would have kind of drawn reminders back towards that.
Yeah, I think part of that's true. If you have a Bible, I don't know if your Bible, if you have the best tool that a Christian, the normal Christian who doesn't want to read commentaries can have is probably a good Bible dictionary. And if you look at the laws of cleanness and uncleanness in any Bible dictionary, they'll have a lot of good discussion. They'll mention hygiene. They'll mention maybe there's an original sin reminder thing. I think the best overall explanation for why are there these laws here? And especially why do you have to offer sacrifices, and why do you have to go through a period of waiting before you're now clean? So there's moral uncleanness, which all of us are unclean, and Jesus is taking care of that if you belong to him. There's also a ritual uncleanness, which is really weird to us, where if you're a woman who's just given birth, you cannot come into God's presence. If you're a man who has some sort of issue, you cannot come into God's presence. The woman with the issue of blood, 12 years, she has not been able to be near her family or to go and offer sacrifices and worship God. She's been cut off from real access to God because of these old covenant laws. This ritual uncleanness is really strange to us, but I think the best way to see it is to see that there are things just about us being sinful people and living in this fallen world, that things that we do or things that happen to us as part of being human that have nothing to do with right or wrong or good or evil separate us from God. Just things that have nothing to do with anything bad or good that we do separate us from God. And to maintain fellowship with God, to be able to come into his presence, we regularly have to bring sacrifices and go through rituals to make us ritually pure enough to be in his presence. And what is that? What's the point of that? I think the overall point that things like that teach us is that there's a gulf between us and between God that even without us consciously doing anything wrong, nothing to do with right or wrong, we can't be in his presence unless we go through the procedures he's put in place to make us pure enough to come near to him. We're intrinsically inferior. And if we want to come near him, beyond just asking for forgiveness for things we do wrong, we have to fix things. We have to go through procedures to cleanse us from normal things that happen in the course of normal life in this fallen world.
Would you say it's like a purification process?
Yeah, it's ritual. It's some sort of ritual purification process that teaches us that we have to go through these steps if we want to be able to even come into God's presence. And we always have to go through these steps all the time. Every month for women, occasionally perhaps for men in our passage here, skin diseases, touching a dead body, anything that, a million different things that just occur because we're people in this world, make us get ritually further away from God.
So it would be a way, possibly a way to keep your relationship close to the Lord. So if, because he desires a relationship with us, but because of the first fall, we couldn't have that relationship, that we had to wait for Jesus to come on the scene. And there were things back then that they had to do, but so it could be because of they were just desiring a relationship for the Lord, they would also do these sacrifices, and that would bring them closer to the Lord. Maybe that was the only way to have a close relationship with the Lord, was to offer these sacrifices. And because I don't think they know that. I mean, they couldn't talk to God. God couldn't look upon them because of their sin, right? So they had to bring in a sacrifice for them to be able to have fellowship with God. And then Jesus came and cleansed everything once for all because of his shed blood. So then we can have now a real close relationship with God. So possibly it was to encourage a relationship with God back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's something of that there. I think Jesus did two things. He made us more, he fixed the moral problem, like we're not good people, so he became good for us. He was perfect for us. But he also made it so we can actually now approach God directly without any ritual uncleanness getting in the way. So in the book of Hebrews, when it says because of Christ's sacrifice, we can go right into the holy place and kneel before the throne of grace and receive help in time of need. I can't recall if that's Hebrews 4 or 10, or maybe I'm just sort of mixing them together. But the only reason why we can go right into the holy place and kneel before the throne of grace in this tabernacle imagery is because Jesus has made us morally pure and ritually pure. So Jesus doesn't when Jesus healed the woman, he didn't tell her she now had to go wait X number of days and bring a sacrifice. He healed her and he made her pure, so to speak. He could touch her and make her ritualistically pure, and he fixed her problem. Jesus takes care of the moral issue, and he makes all of us clean, like ritualistically clean. If you belong to Christ, you can always come right to God with your problems, with your prayers, with your confessions, and there's nothing you need to do because of some sort of ritual issue. There's no issue of blood that's going to stop you from being able to come to God. If you're a coroner, there's no ritual issue that's going to stop you from praying to God after you've done an autopsy on a body. Jesus has made you perfectly clean, morally and ritually. The ritual cleanness thing is really hard for us to get, and I've explained it a bunch of times. I still don't think I do it very well, but I think that's what that is behind all of these strange laws and rules like what we see in our passage here. Why God cares about these things. Hygiene, yes. But there's something deeper than hygiene. It's always tied toward God's holiness, his otherness, and him being who he is and us being us. And the cleanness or uncleanness about the blood issue or anything else has nothing to do with anything you've done. It just has to do with what we are. Being a sinful human being, just being a human being who's not perfect, makes us separated from God, even by things that have nothing to do with right or wrong. So I think that's the best way to see rules like this and to appreciate how much Jesus changed our relationship with God. So do you see how much closer your relationship with God is than what you see depicted here? If you, there's nothing that a Christian can do that makes you ritually impure, so you have to wait to approach God. And in the old covenant, you had to approach through a priest, and you couldn't even go to God. He was back there in the building, in the inner room in the building. You're outside. You couldn't physically approach to God in the same way that we can now, which is what the book of Hebrews talks about. Jesus has made our relationship with God infinitely closer than what we read about in the Old Covenant.